For the first time in many years, a quiet alarm is echoing inside the financial centers of Washington. It is not the sound of conflict or the threat of war, but something far more unsettling for the global order that has shaped the world since the end of World War II. A coalition of rising nations known as BRICS is preparing a major financial step, and many inside the International Monetary Fund are deeply worried about what comes next. The question now is simple. If the IMF begins to lose its influence, who will gain power and who will lose it? Across the city of Ouagadougou, as the evening dust settles over the Sahel, a shopkeeper named Mariam counts her earnings and remembers the years when rising interest rates crushed her family. Decisions made in offices thousands of miles away determined the price of her flour, the cost of her fuel, and even her children's future. Her story is shared by millions across Africa who have lived under complex financial structures they never chose and could never challenge. Today, things appear to be changing. Some leaders see the shift as a threat. Others see it as long overdue justice. BRICS officials claim they are preparing a financial alternative that could offer loans without the strict conditions of the IMF, without requiring nations to cut hospitals, schools, or basic social support programs. If this becomes reality, it could reshape global power, weaken Washington's leverage, and open a new path for African countries seeking more control over their destiny. But is this truly the beginning of a better future, or simply a new form of influence wearing a different face? And what happens if the IMF can no longer shape the rules of the world economy? Before we go further, take a moment to reflect. In a world where financial pressure can break a nation without a single shot being fired, is it possible that the next great struggle for power will be fought not with armies, but with currencies? If this story touches something within you, perhaps a memory of a time when the world felt more stable, or a belief in fairness for all people, stay with me. This journey matters, not only for Africa, but for anyone who cares about justice and dignity. So what exactly is BRICS planning, and why is the IMF so alarmed? That is where our story truly begins. To understand why the IMF is unsettled, we must look directly at the financial plan. BRICS is quietly preparing behind closed doors. Early reports indicate that BRICS officials are finalizing a new lending mechanism designed to rival traditional IMF loans. Instead of demanding currency devaluation, subsidy cuts, or strict austerity programs, BRICS intends to offer funding built on long-term development and resource-backed security. For countries across Africa that have struggled for decades under the weight of external conditions, this represents a dramatic shift that could redefine how nations borrow, invest, and grow. Before we break down the details, take a second to reflect on your own sense of financial stability. If you believe economic fairness matters, feel free to share your thoughts later, because this story affects every person who values justice and dignity. According to insiders, the plan centers around a BRICS development guarantee that would allow member nations and partners to access funds using natural resources as collateral, rather than being forced into painful public spending cuts. In practical terms, this could mean that a gold-rich nation like Mali, or a country with vast agricultural potential like Ethiopia, could borrow money to build roads, power plants, or irrigation systems without slashing teacher salaries or closing hospitals. For the IMF, which has long used financial conditions to shape policy across the global South, this represents a loss of control that could weaken its authority. The potential impact is enormous. Over the last 30 years, more than 40 African nations have taken IMF loans, with conditions that often pushed them into unpopular reforms. In Burkina Faso, hospital budgets were cut multiple times during the early 2000s as part of structural adjustment programs. In Kenya, rising fuel taxes were linked to loan agreements. In Ghana, currency devaluation reduced the value of local savings almost overnight. These decisions were not made by local leaders alone, but were heavily influenced by requirements negotiated in distant cities. This is why the BRICS proposal matters so deeply to people on the ground. To illustrate this, consider the story of Isa, a small-scale farmer living near Bobo Dioulasso. For years, Isa struggled with unpredictable fertilizer prices. When the currency weakened under IMF guidelines, his input costs soared, and he was forced to sell 2 of his cows to keep planting. When asked how he felt about BRICS entering the financial arena, Isa replied that he did not know what BRICS or the IMF truly represented. But he knew one thing clearly. Every time international policies changed, African families like his felt the consequences long before foreign experts did. His words are echoed by thousands of families across the continent who have lived through cycles of debt, inflation, and difficult reforms. Now imagine a scenario where borrowing could be based on resources instead of austerity. BRICS officials say this new approach could protect local economies from sudden shocks. For example, instead of cutting public workers' salaries, a country could pledge a percentage of its mineral output or agricultural production to guarantee repayment. Supporters argue this system respects national sovereignty and encourages long-term growth rather than short-term financial correction. Critics, however, warn that it may give BRICS members too much influence over African resources. Some worry that nations desperate for funding could sign long-term deals that risk losing control of their mines or farmland. This debate is now unfolding across diplomatic circles, from Beijing to Pretoria, and from Addis Ababa to Brasilia. Inside the IMF, analysts fear that if this model succeeds, dozens of countries may turn away from Washington-based institutions entirely. The IMF is especially concerned about losing its role as the primary global financial stabilizer. Without African participation, the IMF would see reduced influence, fewer loan programs, and a weakening ability to manage crises. This is why top officials are monitoring every BRICS announcement with extraordinary attention. Still, the question is not whether BRICS can create a new financial tool, but whether African nations will trust it enough to make a historic shift. And that leads us to a crucial moment in this story, the point where global power, national sovereignty, and the hopes of millions intersect. But what sparked the sudden acceleration of this plan, and why is the tension rising so quickly? The answer lies in the dramatic events that followed. The turning point arrived when BRICS leaders held a closed-door meeting in Johannesburg and quietly confirmed that they were accelerating the launch of their new financial instrument. Reports claim that during the meeting, several African representatives presented data showing how existing IMF conditions had weakened local industries and pushed millions into deeper poverty. One delegate described the situation using a simple image. He said that for decades, African nations had been standing in a rising river, trying to keep their heads above water, while the current kept getting stronger. When he said those words, the room fell silent, and according to one source, that moment convinced BRICS leaders to move faster. The reaction from the IMF was immediate. Analysts within the organization warned that if African nations adopted the BRICS system, global financial stability could be jeopardized. Some argued that the new model lacked oversight, while others said it could encourage risky borrowing. But behind these official statements, there was a wave of private concern. If the BRICS system reduces IMF influence, Washington's long-held financial leverage could weaken at a strategic time when global power is already shifting. While this debate intensified among global institutions, the most powerful reactions came from ordinary people who have carried the weight of economic decisions for decades. In Dakar, a young teacher named Fatou spoke at a community meeting where residents discussed the soaring cost of living. She explained how budget cuts linked to international loan conditions had reduced school funding and forced classrooms to operate with outdated materials. She said that if BRICS offered a real alternative that protected social programs, she believed people across Africa would embrace it with hope. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and several older residents nodded because they remembered earlier decades of hardship linked to financial reforms they never understood. Stories like Fatou's began circulating online and in local radio broadcasts, and the intensity of public interest surprised many observers. If you find yourself reflecting on these voices, on the desire for fairness and stability, feel free to share your thoughts later. These real-life stories help shape conversations that global institutions often overlook. Governments also reacted. South Africa pushed strongly for the new BRICS instrument, describing it as a step toward balanced global governance. Nigeria expressed cautious interest, noting that it needed proof that the model could protect national currency stability. Ethiopia saw the plan as a possible lifeline for infrastructure development. Meanwhile, nations like Japan and France quietly urged the IMF to improve its flexibility to avoid losing influence. Inside Washington, policy advisors warned that the United States could not ignore the changing mood in Africa. They stressed that Africa is home to massive mineral reserves, strategic sea routes, and a young population that will shape the future of the global economy. If these nations shift their financial alliances, the geopolitical balance will shift with them. The debate reached a dramatic moment when leaked documents suggested that several African countries were already exploring long-term agreements tied to gold and rare earth minerals as part of the potential BRICS system. These documents were never officially confirmed, but their appearance fueled tension worldwide. Critics warned that such deals might give BRICS too much control over Africa's resources. Supporters argued that Africa was already losing wealth under existing models and deserved a new framework. The emotional peak came during a televised town hall in Nairobi, where a local economist held up two photos. The first showed a hospital ward from 5 years earlier, with broken beds and equipment. The second photo showed the same ward today, still underfunded and overcrowded. He asked the audience whether they believed the current system was working for them. The room remained silent, and then applause erupted. That moment captured the heart of the debate. People are not choosing between financial systems. They are choosing between futures. As the debate intensifies, the pressure on both BRICS and the IMF continues to rise. But the most important question remains unanswered. If this financial struggle reshapes global influence, how will it affect the daily lives of millions across Africa and beyond? And more importantly, who is truly prepared for the consequences that are coming next? As the BRICS plan continued gaining momentum, the potential consequences for everyday citizens and political systems across Africa became impossible to ignore. In many cities from Accra to Bamako, families gathered in living rooms lit by dim lamps, talking late into the night about what a shift away from IMF influence could truly mean for them. Some saw hope in the possibility of stable food prices and stronger social programs, while others worried about falling into new forms of dependency tied to foreign interests. The stakes were highest for ordinary people living in fragile economies. In Burkina Faso, for example, inflation has pushed the cost of basic grains up by more than 20% in 2 years. If BRICS successfully provides development-oriented loans that protect subsidies instead of cutting them, households might finally gain relief from rising prices that have eroded family savings. But if the shift leads to currency instability or speculative pressure, food markets could become even more volatile. This tension is deeply personal for many. Consider the story of Awa, a widowed mother of 3 in northern Ghana. Her small vegetable stall once supported her children, but after multiple rounds of structural reforms over the years, fuel prices rose sharply and transportation costs doubled. She now walks miles to a wholesale market because she cannot afford a seat on the truck that once carried her produce. When she heard about the BRICS proposal, she said she wished for a system that would stop punishing the poor every time global lenders disagreed with local governments. Her words reflect a sentiment growing across the region. At the political level, the potential shift is even more profound. African governments facing election pressure are watching public opinion closely. Leaders in Kenya and Zambia know that citizens are tired of repeated austerity cycles, and several are quietly evaluating whether aligning with the BRICS model could boost their domestic credibility. Meanwhile, opposition parties in various countries warn that partnering with BRICS could increase foreign political influence in different ways, especially if loans are backed by access to critical minerals. This debate has already entered parliament floors in South Africa and Ethiopia, where lawmakers have spent hours arguing whether the benefits outweigh the risks. The new dynamic is testing regional alliances as well. The African Union has long prioritized reducing dependency on external financial institutions, and BRICS appears to be offering a pathway toward that goal. However, traditional partners in Europe are urging caution, reminding African leaders that sudden changes in financial orientation could disrupt long-standing agreements tied to trade and security cooperation. As these conversations unfold, think for a moment about what stability means to you. If you believe economic security and fairness are essential for strong families and peaceful societies, your thoughts and reflections matter, because stories like these shape the future of entire regions. On the ground, the social impact of this shift is already visible. Community organizers in Senegal report growing public optimism as people imagine a future where national budgets are built around local priorities instead of foreign conditions. Youth groups in Uganda are discussing how a new financial landscape might support job creation rather than cut funding for development programs. Yet despite this optimism, humanitarian workers warn that sudden financial transitions often come with risks. If existing IMF programs are suspended before BRICS alternatives are fully operational, vulnerable communities may experience short-term disruptions. Aid groups are preparing for possible fluctuations in food imports, currency dips, or temporary gaps in health funding. Politically, some governments fear that shifting too quickly could spark internal tension. In nations where corruption is already a major concern, critics argue that resource-backed loans might unintentionally empower elites who can negotiate deals without transparency. The risk, they say, is not the BRICS model itself, but the internal systems that might misuse it. And so Africa stands at a crossroads. On one path lies the promise of financial independence, stronger social programs, and budgets aligned with local needs. On the other lies uncertainty, potential instability, and the danger of replacing one form of influence with another. As the debate grows louder, one question becomes unavoidable. How will the United States and its allies respond to a shift that could redefine global financial power and challenge decades of established policy? From the perspective of the United States, the rise of a BRICS-backed lending system is more than a financial event. It is a strategic shift that touches the core of American influence in the developing world. Washington has long relied on institutions like the IMF to support global stability and to ensure that partner nations follow policies aligned with transparent governance and fiscal responsibility. If African countries begin turning toward BRICS instead, American policymakers fear that the shift could weaken long-standing diplomatic ties and create new power centers outside traditional alliances. Analysts at several U.S. think tanks have already voiced concern that BRICS loans tied to mineral or resource guarantees could reshape the global supply chain and give China and Russia greater leverage over critical commodities. For older Americans watching this story unfold, the issue is not just finance. It is about national security, energy independence, and the stability of regions that have historically impacted global peace. Some experts warn that if the U.S. loses its voice in Africa's financial future, extremist groups and rival powers could exploit economic instability to strengthen their influence. At the same time, many American economists acknowledge that African frustration with the existing system is real. They argue that if the IMF wants to maintain relevance, it must become more flexible, more human-centered, and more aligned with the everyday needs of families around the world. Countries in Europe are watching closely as well. France is concerned about losing influence in West Africa, while Germany fears that global financial fragmentation could weaken coordinated crisis responses. Japan has urged caution, reminding global partners that sudden financial shifts can trigger unpredictable market reactions. As you listen to these perspectives, consider what stability and fairness mean in your own life. If you believe that financial justice shapes the future of nations just as much as diplomacy or military power, your thoughts and reflections matter. This global debate is not just about governments. It is about people and the choices they make. With the world watching and tensions rising, the key question now is whether this growing divide between BRICS and the IMF is manageable, or whether it signals the beginning of a deeper financial struggle that could reshape the global order. And if that struggle intensifies, what will it mean for the people of Africa who stand at the center of it all? As we reach the end of this journey, the future of Africa's financial landscape stands at a defining moment. If BRICS succeeds in launching its new lending system, the shift could open doors to stability, development, and a sense of economic dignity that millions have long been denied. Yet it could also introduce new vulnerabilities if nations move faster than their institutions can adapt. Experts warn that if the BRICS model expands before Africa's internal governance systems are strong enough to manage resource-backed loans, the continent could face unexpected risks such as poor contract oversight or political tension across regions already struggling with fragile stability. Imagine what could happen if mineral-backed agreements lock countries into long-term commitments they cannot renegotiate. Or consider the possibility that sudden changes in global lending patterns could spark a wave of uncertainty in financial markets, pushing food prices higher for families who are already stretched thin. In a place like Burkina Faso, where leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré are pushing for sovereignty and economic independence, the choices made today could determine whether the next decade becomes a period of renewal or a period of deeper struggle. And the world is watching because Africa's success or failure will influence global markets, national security priorities, and the political balance far beyond its borders. If you have followed this story with a sense of concern or hope, reflect on what it means for ordinary people who stand at the center of these decisions. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on open fields. They happen quietly in negotiation rooms, currency markets, and the daily lives of parents trying to keep their children safe and fed. If this story has touched something within you, perhaps a belief in justice, in fairness, or in the idea that every nation deserves the chance to stand on its own feet, feel free to share your thoughts. Conversations like these matter because they remind the world that dignity is not a privilege. It is a right. And as we look to the months ahead, one question remains. If BRICS and the IMF continue toward confrontation, and if financial alliances fracture even further, will Africa emerge stronger and more united? Or will it find itself standing alone at a crossroads that will shape its destiny for generations? Only time will tell, and until that answer becomes clear, we will continue searching for truth in a world that is changing faster than ever.